I just asked me which job was the most difficult one. I think head of the Social Democrats in Germany. But so, and then I have to correct Mr. Fust. I did not ask for speaking in English. You pushed me to speak in English. I mean, because to be very honest, I was too much engaged in politics when I was a student. I should have been more engaged in learning English. But of course, I understood that it's maybe easier if I would try to speak in English. So first of all, Commissioner Oettinger and Minister Padua and Mr. Fust, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak about the future of Europe. And I would say I can underline every single word which Commissioner Oettinger said, and I would love to hear you speaking in the German Bundestag and the German government. In this way, it's necessary in these days, not only because our current debate, in principle, I think it's necessary to have a more optimistic view to the future of Europe. And because of the challenges Europe is faced with today, I think it's important to say at the very beginning of every discussion that Europe still is an extraordinary example for what is possible if nations decide to work together. That it is possible to overcome hatreds, becoming first partners and then friends in only a bit more than one generation after being arch-enemies for some 100 years. This is the example that Europe offers to all the regions of the world marred in war, civil war, and apparently never-ending hatred. It is possible to move on, to overcome it. Today, despite all the problems and challenges, there is nowhere on the planet where people live more secure, more democratic, free and peaceful than in the European Union. I'm saying this at the beginning of every discussion about the future of Europe because the greatest danger for our united Europe is fear and the mood of hopelessness. So, ladies and gentlemen, however, our Europe is now facing new, previously unknown challenges. Following the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, the bipolar world order with its Eastern and Western blocs seemed to turn into a unipolar world order 2.0, in which democratic capitalism with the United States as the hegemonial power led to the end of history, like the political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote 1992 in his book. Less than 30 years later, we can see that that is anything but true. The US is experiencing hegemonic and imperial overstretch and abandoning the global stage for the town hall dance floor. Old revisionist powers like Russia are intent to filling the resulting vacuum. And countries like China and soon India and the young Africa will soon be staking their claims. We don't yet know what the New World Order 3.0 will look like, but Europe and Germany should not sit back and watch others develop it, but should boldly advocate their own ideas, seek allies, and promote their interests. So the challenges facing Europe today truly are huge. First of all, there are internal tensions in Europe. In economic terms, tensions exist between Northern and Southern Europe. These will become very apparent as decisions on a possible debt relief starting looming large, and let's face it, the French president's proposals to reform the Eurozone and Europe are remarkable, just as remarkable as they are controversial in countries like Germany, like Netherlands and Finland. In political terms, there are tensions between Western and Eastern Europe, exemplified in the arguments about the rule of law, freedom of press, and independence of the judiciary between countries like France and Germany on the one side, and Poland and Hungary on the other. In terms of the rule of law, there is potential for conflict between Northwest Europe and Southeast Europe, because signs of endemic corruption, bad governance, and the rise of organized crime, not just in Slovakia, are alarming. The problem will get worse if, as the Commission has just proposed, Serbia and Albania join the European Union by 2025, and in parallel to this process, the rule of law becomes weaker rather than stronger. So there's plenty of work to do within the European Union. But at the same time, the global political landscape is changing so quickly and so radically that even a far more united European Union would find it hard to remain steadfast. The development of a global data-driven economy is putting Europe's, and particularly Germany's, traditional industry-based economic model under massive and unprecedented competitiveness pressure. Concepts like disruptive or artificial intelligence mean nothing less than a departure from all the key factors that have driven our economic success so far. Europe's fragmented research and investment scene, combined with a body of regulations neither designed to react swiftly to innovation and market developments, nor capable of handling the size of global players we need in Europe, are making it incredibly difficult for us to keep up with these changing global economic trends. The United States is abandoning the international edifice of liberal order, which itself created it. It is pursuing a new cost-benefit approach in which, for the first time since World War II, it no longer regards the benefits gained from its role as global power as being enough to justify the costs. New powers are filling the void this is creating, particularly China. The new Silk Route initiative is but one indication of things to come. Certainly, since the last Congress of the Communist Party, we've been able to see that the country has increasingly come to regard its international development as being sufficiently stable for it to pursue a much more vigorous foreign and interest-based policy, thus securing its independence and existing its economic, political, and I'm sure also military international influence. Such development was bound to happen regardless of the United States. This is because the world order established after World War II has for some time now failed to reflect the shift in power towards the world's more populous continents and countries. So in some ways, China's aspirations are normal, but they pose a particular challenge for us Europeans. There are also other powers muscling in on the vacuum left by the United States, and with it, the West. Russia, Iran, Turkey, for example, are currently showing in Syria that we Europeans, aside from minor roles being assigned to the two Security Council members, France and Britain, can simply be ignored when it comes to the process of restructuring the country. Nor do we Europeans play a role, or at best only a minor role, in the other flashpoints in the Middle East. We have no say in the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, in the conflict on the Gulf, in Yemen, and sadly, in the Palestinian conflict. The bitter truth is, while we are holding speeches bemoaning the situation and calling for international law to be upheld, others are radically shifting the axis of power in the region, or at least trying to do it. And then there's Africa. The continent will double its population to 3 billion people by 2050 at the latest. In yet another of Europe's immediate neighborhoods, our influence is diminishing rather than growing. Again, China is the country which has been spending years investing in Africa's infrastructure, raw material deposits, and even education. We Europeans tend to see Africa as a problem continent and interpret our role there more and more as an attempt to stem what we perceive to be a growing stream of refugees. China, in contrast, does not fear the arrival of a single African refugee and clearly regards Africa as a continent of opportunity. So, as we can see, Europe's future will be determined by far more than its ability to cope with its internal tensions. And it will only be possible to overcome the external challenges if Europe is more strongly unified. We are a long way at present from succeeding in either of these areas. Anyone who conducts a sober analysis of the situation in Europe will soon realize that the threat to Europe is not rising nationalism or populism, but our own inability to find the right answers to the challenge of our age. It is this political vacuum which allows the solutions presented by populists and new nationalists to take hold at Europe's societies. At present, we Europeans need to be particularly concerned about the interpretation of Europe at the White House in Washington. For me, not the trade conflict is the most worrying situation. Much more worries me the perspective to Europe which lies behind this trade conflict. For 70 years, Europe was in the interest of the United States of America. Europe was founded by the US because the Americans wanted to prevent a Third World War as a result of national extremism in Europe. Europe was an American idea in the interest of the Americans. We were allies and partners, not only in NATO, but also as parts of the international liberal architecture. Now it seems to be the complete opposite. For the new American administration, Europe seems to be a conspiracy against the United States of America. The White House put sanctions against Europe because our steel and aluminium imports to the US are seen as threats to national security. That's something different than a threat to competitiveness, threat to national security of the United States of America. Europe as a danger for the national security of the US. This ideology is worrying me much more than the trade conflict itself. Of course, there are still a lot of reasons for hope that this ideology will change again. But Europe will only be able to uphold its position in the world, its values and its interests, if we stand closer together than we have done. In this situation, Europe will need strategic capabilities, and it didn't need before. In order to gain a better understanding of our own role and the specific challenges, we need to start by defining the parallelogram of forces in which Europe is operating. The liberal intellectual Ralph Dahrendorf once said the following scathing words about our continent. Europe has no real influence. At any rate, it has no European interest that could inform this influence. Dahrendorf said this in an interview back in the year 2000. Perhaps his words need a bit of explanation for people today, but put briefly, I would say that Dahrendorf wanted to warn people not to expect too much from Europe in terms of foreign policy. His verdict came as no real surprise, as Europe was founded as an internal construct, not as a global player. The first question was why we do not act as a global player. Because that was Europe was not founded to be a world actor. We were founded under the slogan, America in, Russians out, Germans down. Why? Because we created 2 world wars in Europe. And then the Americans and some others formed NATO and the European Union to bring Germany in a construction where we will not go again for a third time. We call it in Germany Sonderweg, no German Sonderweg again. And so we were concentrated on developing our own economy, peace in Europe, and for the rest, for the world, we had our security members, France and Britain, and of course the US. And if it went wrong, then we had somebody to blame. That was the easiest way to live for us Germans and us Europeans. That's what we learned. That's what we were trained for. And now the situation is completely different, and that's maybe the biggest challenge to Europe. A role on the world stage was reserved for the European members of the UN Security Council. What is clear is that the ethical foreign policy based on values to which we Germans aspire will not be enough in order to survive in a world dominated by economic, political, and military self-interests. That means that if Europe is to change, Germany in particular will need to change. So the German question is back on the table, but in an inverted form. After 1945, the question was about tying Germany in and preventing the country from ever again trying to go it alone. Today, the question is about my country's willingness to shoulder more responsibility. We may have learned to do that, but only in economic terms. There are good reasons why Germany has become a geopolitical teetotaler since the end of the Second World War, because whenever we weren't, the consequences for the rest of the world were disastrous. Over the years, however, we have become comfortable in this role of geopolitical vegetarians. But in a world full of carnivores, life as a vegetarian is a bit uncomfortable. So, in this changed situation, we are too large as a country to be able to shirk the issue. The direction Europe takes will depend very much on the attitude Germany takes. If we try to stay on the sidelines and to be a sort of second Switzerland, economically significant, but politically irrelevant internationally, Europe will stay weak. If we are willing to help develop a projection of European power, we will have to do so in a way that does not result in any renewed hegemonical goals. For 70 years, other people have kept us safe. Now, we need to learn to do it ourselves. Certainly, we won't be able to keep out of it. As I say, the German question is back, or rather, the questions for us Germans are back. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not yet possible to tell what tomorrow's world order will look like. So much is in flux, and as a Chinese saying puts it, most of the players are carefully crossing the river by feeling the stones. I believe there could be one of three possible new global systems emerging. The G0 world order. This is a world in which power is distributed too widely that no one has a clear leading role. The American political scientist Ian Bremmer described it like this: no single country or bloc of countries has the political and economic leverage or the will to drive a truly international agenda. For a trading and middle-ranking power like Germany, such a free interplay of forces is incredibly dangerous. The step away from rules and regulation may appear to some people like the continuation of individualization in international relations. In truth, it would endanger the very foundations of our security and prosperity. Second alternative is the G2 world. This would be a sort of new bipolar, or driven by the rivalry of two superpowers, one of them being emergent, China, and a substitute for the Soviet Union of the Cold War era. In this scenario, China draws its sense of self from historic self-image as a middle kingdom. The upheavals in the United States and Europe confirms its belief that its own model is much better for the 21st century than our models. In view of the great promises of prosperity raised by the Chinese model, I'm not surprised that a lot of countries are inclined to fall into line with China. And the third alternative is the GX world. This order would also consist of numerous poles, although fewer than G20 we are familiar with, and certainly different ones to the G7. The key difference to the G0 world order would be the existence of binding rules and structures. This world prevents the interplay of the poles depending on the respective balance of power or on the skills of today's Metternichs and Palmerstons. Multipolarity coupled with a binding order would be the trademark of this system. I'm sure it will not surprise you that my preferred option is world order number 3. Whether it has a chance of establishing itself depends not least on the part played by the European Union. But regardless of which direction the world takes, the EU will only be able to survive if it defines its own interests and projects its powers. In fact, even if Britain leaves, one of the strongest bonds with the European continent could be formed with the United Kingdom and shared its strategic and security capabilities more with Europe than it does today. In the past, the UK has been very reluctant to do this for various reasons. European defense initiatives tended to quickly arouse suspicions that they might be devised as an alternative to NATO. Britain wanted no part of that. But we continental Europeans need the British skills if we want to develop into a serious global player. The fact that the European Union lacks the means of projecting its powers has meant that wherever the United States has drawn back, countries have turned not to Europe, but to other countries which they expect to offer more operationalized power. In the Middle East, for example, to Russia. In Africa, to China. In the latter case, African countries have turned to China mainly because their economic necessities encountered a neo-colonial aspiration on the part of the Chinese. But as China continues to build a link between economic prosperity and political stability, its model will become increasingly attractive compared with what the West has to offer. We are in the middle of realizing that our rivals are not asleep. Just a few months ago, the Russian president held court in Sochi, not for the soccer world championship. He invited some of his leaders. His first visitors were the Syrian president, followed by the Turkish, and finally by the Iranian leader. They celebrated victory in Syria, which those present felt was now secure. A German newspaper wrote, "Black souls at the Black Sea." The regional powers gathered in Sochi are not friends, but they do have some things in common. They look both inwardly and outwardly to their historic greatness. And there are times when they're willing to invest a fair amount in showing the West who's calling the shots. You might say that they're willing to pay a sort of superpower tax for their enhanced power status, economic constraints, diplomatic condemnation, financial penalties. They are willing to accept quite a lot in order to document their aspiration to regional leadership and their national sovereignty. We can see this in the way Russia is treating Ukraine. Then there is Iran pumping a lot of resources in supporting militias and terrorist groups in the region in order to control neighboring states. And Turkey is not afraid of military operations or of confrontations with the United States in order to defend its interests against attempts to create a Kurdish state in northern Syria. Syria, by the way, has so far been the biggest prize attained by those three ancient empires. And we should be quite self-critical about this. Throughout the last 7 years, the West has failed to strike a balance between its highly ambitious demands and the resources it has dedicated to achieving those demands. Theodore Roosevelt once says, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Our policy on Syria seemed to be based on the opposite motto, "Speak loudly and carry a small stick." When Europeans expressed their outrage at the new US policies and the country's partly withdrawal from its responsibility for the international public good, what they might actually be reasonable about in the fact that this has revealed Europe's weakness. We are certainly seeing one thing very clearly, just how much of our burden was borne by the United States in the past. The withdrawal and replacement patterns witnessed in the Middle East can also be seen in other parts of the world. We just need to look across to Asia, where China is moving into areas which used to be dominated exclusively by the presence and policy of the United States. But its strategy is a different one to that employed by Russia and its cohorts. Only once it has established a sound economic basis will it softly start creating military independencies, so far at least. The One Belt, One Road initiative, the new Silk Road, is not a nostalgic trip down Marco Polo's lane, but a tangible geo-economic strategy which will enable China to enforce its ideas of order in terms of trade policy, geopolitically, and perhaps ultimately also military. It's probably fair to say that China seems to be the only country in the world which currently has a tangible geo-economic strategy in place. That is not something we can criticize them for. On the contrary, I feel a sense of respect at the speed and power of the country's development over the last 30 to 40 years. But we of the old world deserve criticism for having failed to develop our own strategy. If we want to readdress the balance, we will have to define our own interests, identify combined US-EU interests, for example, and place them next to China's. Only then we will be able to arrive at a viable balance between all three sides. Against the background of the current differences with the United States, we must not be tempted to regard China's efforts to maintain a multilateral order as an altruistic endeavor. Over the last few years, China has become even more autocratic. Despite all the opportunities and possibilities, the country is facing gigantic internal challenges. So, ladies and gentlemen, Europe has to tackle a truly Herculean task. Too many factors at once, wrote German diplomat Kurt Rietzler into his diary in the summer of 1914. Rietzler was private secretary to von Bethmann-Hollweg, the German Chancellor in that time. His previous diary entry reads, "Fate is mostly entirely stupid and unconscious and gets lost in pure coincidences. But it's all become so multifaceted in its damned, confused modern world, impossible to calculate or to understand." 7 days later, World War I began. Rietzler's words aptly describe our age too, not because we are facing the immediate outbreak of a world war, but too many factors at once is also a very befitting description of today's international situation. Anybody striving towards unity in Europe will need to remember to step into the shoes of the most vulnerable country or any given issue, to look at this from their perspective and allow this insight to influence his own policies. If talking security policy, we need to look at the points of view of the Baltic nations and Poland. In the case of fiscal and economic policy, it's the Southern Europe countries whose perspective we need to take. And with regard to refugee policy, we need to keep Italy's concern foremost in mind. It will not do in criticizing the American first approach and then taking the same approach at home. We Germans in particular tend at times to think that we are the only ones with appropriate ideas for the course of action Europe needs to take. Even if we act with the best of intentions, as for example in the case of the refugee influx, we need to consider what others in Europe think about it before we make our move. The issue of migration policy has certainly caused grave ruptures in Europe's fabric. Right-wing nationalism is on the rise, but there's also a liberal variation of the old nationalist thinking that the German way is the right way for the world, or at least for Europe. So, in a straight-talking way, Dahrendorf highlighted the problem, the seriousness of which we are only just coming to understand. The European Union is not an important factor in world politics, but we have to do a lot of work that Europe in future is this important factor in world politics. Without the close ties to the United States, it certainly won't be one anywhere in the near future. The truth is, we cannot live with Donald Trump, but we also cannot live without the United States. So this raises the question as to whether and how we can retain these ties in a new form, and what we as Europeans need to do in order to become a factor in world politics. This includes making use of economic means, political and cultural means, and if necessary, the willingness to deploy military means. Certainly, if there is no real projection of Europeans' power, fragile states will not turn to us when they are looking for help and partners. At a global level, we are still in a transitional phase of the world order. from a previous bipolar order with clear rules into a time of an unknown order, with new players on the pitch of international politics, and want to and will play a part in shaping the new rules. For better or for worse, the Europe-centricity of our politics will have to take this on board. Because this development poses challenges to the liberal order, this affects the European Union as a part of the West, which at least aspires to be a rule-based order or to engage in values-based politics. In foreign policy in particular, therefore, the European Union will have to rise above itself. In today's agitated world, we Europeans can only assert ourselves if we stand together. Our kids will have the alternative between no voice in the world or a common European voice. Let's not pretend otherwise. The world sees Europe as rich but weak. That tempts people to engage in intervention and manipulation. And there's one thing that Moscow, Washington, and Beijing have in common: the perception that Europe is not a factor they have to take seriously. But it's not only the strong countries which have no interest in Europe. The weak ones don't have it either, because we don't project any power. When people began to realize that the United States wanted to withdraw from its engagement in Syria, the rebels against the Assad regime turned not to us Europeans, but to Moscow. Holding on to what we have achieved so far is not enough, since it's always possible that the achieved turns out not to be resilient enough. We need to make use of the good times to prepare for the next crisis. That's all that the French president is trying to do. Germany has a major role to play in the search for a robust European foreign policy which is capable to taking action. Germany needs to be ready to shoulder this responsibility, and above all, those holding political responsibility need to be willing to explain it to the people of Germany, to argue for it, to gain approval for it. After all, in democracies, and the capability to engage in strategic policy development ultimately depends on the capability to get a majority for it in their own society. So far, most of our policymakers have refused to take on this job. Herfried Münkler has published an interesting book about the 30 Years' War. In it, he is very severe with Germany's foreign policy elite. He complains about a German fixation on the law as a means of coping with political challenges, which is tantamount to a rejection of political realities. Or, to resort to another quotation, global politics is not decided by local court rulings. Münkler complains that people in Germany are afraid to ruthlessly analyze what is actually happening. Instead, their minds are fixed on the horizon of moral standard and imperatives. Quite simply, he sees a lack of strategic political thinking. I think Münkler is spot on. So, what we have to do? We need a clear and realistic, sober view of the world as it is, not a world that we wish that it should be. Not just a vision of what it should be like. Starting from idealistic ideas doesn't help. Taking this cool view of reality and holding fast to a clear compass of values, we should then fight hard for what we want to keep and what we want to achieve. We should cast off oversized moral or normative blinkers and be willing to open our eyes to making what Münkler calls strategic compromises. If Europe is to stand up successfully for its interests in the liberal, rules-based order, it needs to resolve a twofold dilemma. International, it needs to strike a new balance between autonomy and community, because the Brexiteers are right about one thing. The concept of ever closer union, the concept of the United States of Europe, has failed for the time being. But that does not mean that Europe has failed. As we strive to keep the Union together, the significance of nation-states will actually tend and increase. And that's no bad thing, because we still have no better point of reference for the rule of law, democracy and liberty than the constitutions of our nation states, whether written or unwritten. In view of these challenges, our understanding of the need to position the European Union is almost scary. We are treating the European Union as if we had a spare one in the cupboard. In this situation, the election of a strongly pro-European president in France is a stroke of luck with historic dimensions. Never before has a French president called Europe's sovereignty a precondition for the sovereignty of his own nation. Macron has recognized the downward spiral in which the European Union finds itself. He is compared to a civil war. This is finger-pointing. There are open threats, there are blockades, knife-edged votes, and not least poisonous cliches. Tensions between the governments and the European Union have increased. And when the governments blame the negotiations in Brussels, they make it easy for the media to keep identifying new battlefronts, the South against the North, the West against the East. The poet Eugen Roth in Germany once wrote, and I apologize that the translation loses the rhyme, "Feeling a fine tree takes less than half an hour. Growing it enough to admire it takes a century." Tragically, just as the current global situation requires the European Union to make more action in foreign policy, the Union seems to be gradually losing its grip on its internal project of reconciliation. Silence is replacing dialogue. Technocracy are outweighing policy making in many areas, and the distance from the people of Europe, from their concerns and their needs is growing. That is why I say that we need to reverse thrust if, in a few years' time, we are not to be standing before the ruins of the European Union and standing helpless before the world. We need to give Europe back its soul. I'm convinced that we Europeans are at a crossroad which we are faced with only every few hundred years on our continent. To explain what I mean, we have to look back exactly 600 years into the year 1418. At that time, the Portuguese Emperor Henry the Navigator sent his European sailors into the unknown along the coastline of West Africa to discover the sea passage to India. The sailors were ready to enter in a very risky trip into a complete unknown and insecure world. Europe stepped on the global stage, and it was the beginning for 600 years of European and transatlantic dominance. At the same time, the Chinese emperor commanded the most powerful fleet in the world. But while the Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator was sending out his fleet, the Chinese emperor Hongji decided to let his fleet fall into disrepair, despite its magnificence and the fact that it had spent the previous 300 years exploring the world. He believed his empire to have more pressing problems. It was the beginning of China's withdrawal from the global stage, which it would not return to for another 600 years, while Europe set out to dominate the world on every continent. So the question is, what will people tell us in our century in around 600 years from now? Will they describe us and our situation as the return of China's dominance in Eurasia and the decline of the old European West? Or will they see us as a generation which again was willing to take risks and which was entering again in a new, uncertain and unknown world to balance the new power of China and others and to defend our European interests? It's up to us to give the answers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very impressive and clear address. I'm sure there are questions or comments, please. If you briefly, kindly introduce yourself.
One quick question. You described a situation in which we are surrounded by a group of carnivores who are moving at a very fast pace. And that leaves us under the impression that Europe should move quickly as well. So I think one question would be, maybe Europe has grown too large, too big, too fast. And as a reaction to that, maybe there's a group of European countries which should move forward in terms of integration and alignment more quickly than others, which would probably be the group of countries which has formed a common currency. That's my question.
My first answer would say, I'm not calling for Europe as a carnivore, but maybe we should be something like a flexitarian. My answer to you, yes, and this allowed in Europe. I think it's Article 9, if I'm right, which allows the cooperation between countries inside the European Union. And we just decided, together with France and some others, to go faster by to build, they called it, the French guys called it a European Intervention Military Force. The only precondition is that that we should not reject the intentions or the interest of others to come on board. That's the only precondition. But I think, yes, it's necessary, and it's not a very new idea. The European currency is an example for that. Schengen is an example for that. And of course also the new defense strategy, they call it PESCO, the permanent cooperation in defense issue. That's also one example that it's possible to have a smaller group which is moving faster.
I have a question regarding China. So you mentioned Chinese investment expanding, as you said, to Africa, but also, we have some investments in Europe, in Hungary. Chinese companies bought the port of Piraeus. And something else you mentioned was the compass of values you see as an important ingredient, I suppose, of economic policy. So my question is, a lot of people say the Chinese are attractive as an investor because they show up and say, here's the investment with no strings attached. We don't talk about protection of rights and so on. So my question is, are we facing a conflict? Either we become irrelevant as Europeans because when we in West we say, we want human rights respected and so on. When competing with the Chinese, are we losing the game because we are imposing these values? Is there a conflict between, let's say, the European way and being successful as an investor competing with China?
If you ask the African leaders, they will answer, no, that's not the question. But if Europe comes and is ready to build even a bicycle road, you will need 10 years to realize it. And at the same time, China is building 3 new harbors and 2 airports. So look to Germany. There is a famous bridge in the near of Cologne. It's not in a good shape, and it's not allowed for heavy vehicles to cross the bridge. And normally you would say, okay, there is a bridge, let's build a new one just on the other side. Yes, by law in Germany, if you would build the new one in the same way like in the 50s, then you would be allowed to do this. But we are not able to build old roads. We do not have capabilities to build old roads. We only can build new roads. But then you are under the restriction of our laws, and you will need maybe 15 years. So you should not mention about human rights, not about environment. The first question is, are we able to show them that we are as fast as the Chinese? That we are willing to invest, that we give interest rates? That's the question. They do not ask us for not pressing them by human rights. Even the democratic ones, they say, okay, you European guys, you're financing micro projects, but I'm in the middle of Africa. I need an infrastructure to the next harbor. If not, I cannot develop my country. But you love these minor projects, so please help us to build a new road, a railroad. But we are not even able to build a railroad between Belgrade and Budapest. And by the way, Your friends, I don't know, I will look what you did in that time. We pushed the Greeks to privatize their harbor in Piraeus in the middle of the crisis. That's, for me, the most stupid idea we had, because you will not get enough money for that. In that time, we said, let's buy the harbor by the European member states and then sell it when time is better. No, we pressed them, and there was only one country who was willing to pay the price, China. And now you see that China is intervening in some decisions of the European Council of Heads and State of Government. For example, if the High Court about freedom, about sea regulation decides about the freedom of navigation in the Chinese Sea against China, normally it would need maybe 10 seconds in the Council of Heads and State and Government to say, yes, of course, we are applauding this the Sea Court's decision. Last time we had two countries who say, why we should discuss about these difficult issues of China, and this is so far away, we should not blame China. It was Hungary and Greece, and maybe for good reasons. So not discussing about environment and human rights, discussing about our own capabilities to do something in a way that a young kid who is born today will see the street before he's passing away. So that's something I would ask for.
So Sigmar Gabriel will need to leave in 2 minutes, but we have room for one more question, I would say. Please.
Hello, Johannes Köhn, Ernst & Young. Just a quick question. 15 years ago, I would have said everybody talked about the age of soft power and basically the age of Europe. And now you've been very critical of that. And is that because soft power in general fails in a way? Is it because you said there's a lacking interest in projecting it? And if the latter is the case, why would one call for hard power in Europe instead? Isn't then the prerequisite also that one kind of has a plan?
I very much support soft power. And we have a lot of soft power, but then we have to use it to give interest rates, to invest in Africa, and so on and so forth. These are soft power mechanisms. But there are some critical situations where soft power is not enough. Look to Syria. When the war starts, Turkey asks us and NATO and the US that we should organize a non-flight zone over Syria because they said, if not, Assad will send his bombs against his own civilian population. We said, oh no, please not. We don't want to be part of this war. We have enough difficulties in Afghanistan. The Americans said, we feel our imperial overstretch. We don't want to have boots on the ground, and so on and so forth. So we rejected it in the idea that what's happening there will not affect us. Some years later, we have more than 1 million refugees in our country coming out of Syria. So when the Russian president asks, I think in 2015 or 16, the American president, please, let's join hands with our military troops and support a ceasefire in Syria together, Russian soldiers, American soldiers. The American president said, no, I promised in my country no boots on the ground. What would you say? Would Europe agreed if the Russian president in that time was asked us to do that? So sometimes soft power is wonderful. Because I'm supporting to be a flexitarian, not a carnivore. But sometimes you need, of course, also military power. If not, I mean, we love to blame the government, the Germans, if we deliver tanks to the president of Egypt because it's not a Westminster democracy. But he has some 1,000 kilometers border to Libya. And if you find something in Libya, then weapons from Mr. Gaddafi. These weapons are crossing Egypt, and you will find it in west of Africa, in front of German and French soldiers, and the hands of Boko Haram, which are you know, they kept women's and young kids. So, should we deliver tanks to Mr. al-Sisi to control its borders? Or should we say, no, he's not a Westminster Democrat, we don't want to be engaged in military issues with him? I would say it's in our interest to do that. We don't want to send our soldiers to Mali to fight against Boko Haram with weapons in their hands, which, by the way, also came from Germany, out of the weapon deposits in Libya. So that I mean that in some respect, sometimes not as a solution for everything, you need also hard power. And in the past, we were in this lucky situation to be a soft power because the hard power was the US. And if it went wrong, we had somebody to blame. I mean, I'm a social democrat. I always blame the Americans for whatever they did. But I love to go to America and to visit national parks, drink Coca-Cola, and hear rock and roll. I mean, that's the opposite. But this easy world is over. It's gone. Now we have to be more engaged in the world. And there are a lot of carnivores, and they will not listen to the soft power of vegetarians. We have to show them also power. And that's what's necessary. And you have to start to debate it in this country. Because for good reasons. I told it to Trump and to his foreign minister that you teach us to be peaceniks. Well, now we are. So now we have to debate again what is our role and how we can do it in a way where a strong Germany will not be the next difficult nature in the center of Europe. That's why I say it's only possible to do it in a European structure, never alone. There are two lessons out of World War II. Never again and never alone. That would be my answer.
We're coming to the end. So regarding the port of Piraeus, to keep up the rest of confidence economists, I can tell you, the port of Piraeus is a source of income. And if you sell a source of income, what you get is the equivalent to the source of income, so you don't get richer at all. And of course, you're right, it shouldn't be sold cheap and in a crisis. But I guess privatization was for something else. Still, I would like to thank you very, very much for this very clear and very impressive speech. This gave us a great start to our Congress. You need to get back to the airport now. Thanks for being here, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. Danke.